Hello?
Hello. So for people, oh good, everybody has your headphones on. You need to put headphones on. The headphones are not, all right. All right, give me a thumbs up if you can hear. All right, some people can hear, which means if you can't hear, it's your headphones. Test, test, test. AEI, AEI, AEI. I can't remember what that is. All right, it seems like most people have gotten the headphones together, so that's exciting. So welcome to this session on alternative proteins for climate, hunger, and global health. We have a jam-packed 90 minutes, and I hope everybody's going to find it interesting and enjoyable. My name is Bruce Friedrich. I'm founder and president of the Good Food Institute. We are a global science think tank with offices in the US, India, Israel, Brazil, Singapore, Japan, and Europe. In Europe, we operate primarily in the UK, Germany, and at the EC level in Brussels. First, I want to say thank you to CGIAR and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization for seeing the value of alternative proteins to climate and nature, hunger and malnutrition, and global health. I am very excited for this session, and I hope you are too. Second, I want to define alternative proteins quickly. For the purpose of this session, alternative proteins is a term of art that describes foods that are produced to provide the sensory experience of animal meat, dairy, and eggs, but using plants, fermentation, or cellular agriculture. We have 8 expert panelists with whom we'll be diving into these issues, and we'll have opening and closing comments from 2 luminaries in the global effort to mitigate climate change and solve hunger and malnutrition. So first up, and without further ado, Sir Andrew Steer is president and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, a $10 billion commitment by Jeff Bezos in 2020 to address nature and climate challenges in this decisive decade. Sir Andrew joined the Bezos Earth Fund from the World Resources Institute, where he served as president and CEO for 8 years. Previously, he served as the World Bank's Special Envoy for Climate Change and as Director General at the UK Department of International Development, followed by a decade in East Asia, where he was head of the World Bank in Vietnam and Indonesia. Under Sir Andrew's leadership, the Bezos Earth Fund has launched 3 centers for sustainable proteins just this year and included them in their $100 million challenge for climate and nature, their AI challenge. So results forthcoming on that. Thank you so much, Sir Andrew Steer. Incredibly grateful to you for your leadership in this issue and excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Bruce, very much. Yeah, let's give Bruce a round of applause here because he certainly deserves it. And I hope everyone has their headphones on, then we can talk normally to each other. So look, thank you for what you're doing. The Good Food Institute has helped us as we think through this issue. And as Bruce says, we've just we're really majoring on this theme. This year we started 3 major research laboratories, one in the United States, one in the UK, and one in Singapore. And I'll say a word about that in a minute. But first, let me tell you what you probably know already, is that we are heading towards something that is totally inevitable, just the pure arithmetic. Animal agriculture accounts for what, 15 to 20% of total greenhouse gas emissions at the moment, thanks to growing population and to growing incomes around the world. Meat consumption is expected to rise by perhaps 60% by 2050. If already animal agriculture is using 80% of all agricultural land, and agricultural land takes half of all of the land that is usable on the planet, just do the math and ask the question, what will happen by 2050 if we keep on a path which we are on with at the moment no evidence that it is starting to change? And it's not so much that people in rich countries are going to eat a whole lot more beef. They're already eating too much beef. It's that those who haven't enjoyed that as much in the past are going to be eating a lot more. And so our view is not to turn everybody into vegans or even vegetarians. Everybody should have a choice. But let's just make sure that that rise is not inexorable, and we need to reduce it. I think calculations have been done by the World Bank and the Good Food Institute suggest that already today we're missing out because of animal land use. We're missing out on 26 gigatons of sequestration that could be taking place. And we need that, quite frankly, if we're going to solve the problem. So our view is, first we've got to really think through how to drive down the prices. Everybody knows there are already perfectly edible alternative proteins from plant-based, from fermented, and even now, albeit expensively, lab-produced. But those are, if you like, just the very, very early prototypes of what can happen. Take the simple arithmetic of what a protein is and how many there are. There are, 200 million proteins. In fact, there's an infinite number of proteins because you can create them as well. The human mind can't sort through them all and figure out exactly what combinations will give the texture and give the taste and enable cost to come down. But actually now with technology and AI and all of the big data capabilities and machine learning, we actually can move forward quite quickly. So the work that we're supporting, with thanks to you, we carried out a worldwide search of research institutions that could do two things. Thing number one, they had to be the best imaginable on science with all the right skills and a demonstrated ability to do the science. Second, they needed to have the capacity to incubate new businesses that are required. Because what we're going to see in the next 10, 20 years is a flowering of private sector companies that are going to build upon open intellectual property which will be created by the scientists, but then they will build on that to create their own products, which increasingly will go into the market. Now, I think, there's a supply side, but there's also a demand side. We're focusing, as you are for the most part, on the supply side. That is, how do you get alternative proteins that are truly tasty and truly nutritious and truly affordable? But there's also the need to shift perceptions, the need to shift diets in general, and there's going to be a battle ahead of us, because I can tell you even today that the Cattlemen's Association and the beef industry is not going to take this lightly. And one of the things that we need to do is be very clear that we're not trying to be anti-farmer in any sense. I don't think there's going to be fewer cattle in the world for decades to come. We just don't want a whole lot more cattle in the world. And we're going to have to be smart politically and psychologically, as well as smart scientifically in this. So the panels that we're about to hear, are really terrific. You've assembled a really great group of people here. And I would like to thank FAO and CGIAR, because we need these heavyweights to be part of the solution. And at the moment, we've got this very nice emerging sort of a portfolio of players. We've got the best NGOs in the world, if you like, that are smart scientifically and smart in terms of lobbying and policy-wise. But then we've got the international organizations here. It's important that, for example, the World Bank and the regional banks come in together with United Nations organizations. CGIAR is the leading sort of association of research institutes in the world. And we need some countries that are really wanting to lead this forward as well. And it's fascinating to talk to ministers of health and ministers of economy in countries whose meat consumption is growing rapidly, because they're looking at the numbers and they're realizing that if their citizens eat a whole lot more beef, they are going to have big health costs down the road, and that will hurt them. They also look at their balance of payments, and they look at, my goodness me, we're going to need to import more soy for our chicken, or we're going to need to import more beef which hurts their balance of payments. And actually, the beauty of alternative proteins is that you can enjoy food security as well as good nutrition. So it is actually a win-win-win situation. So I'm going to stop now, but simply to pledge on behalf of philanthropy that we're all in on this. I'm very happy that you are too. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you very much, Sir Andrew Steer. Yeah, amen to the last bit in particular of what you said. And the Bezos Earth Fund really is leading the way on putting this way of thinking about the future of agriculture in front of more and more people. All right, we're going to have two roughly 30-minute panels, 4 experts on each panel. The first panel is going to concentrate somewhat generally on the benefits of alternative proteins to climate, nature, and global health. The second will concentrate, again, somewhat generally on alternative proteins and their both macroeconomic impact on affordable, healthy food and their potential as a direct intervention to solve hunger and malnutrition. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my first set of panelists to join me in front. Teresa, Zatuni, Debbie, and Christina. If you could sit wherever you would like. All right, I'm going to do quick introductions, and then I will move into our conversation. So Teresa is a director at Systemic in their nature and food practice and worked previously at McKinsey. Systemic has been doing some really great analysis in the last few years, focused on both food systems and alternative proteins. Zaytouni is a senior advisor at the FAIR Initiative. He has 27 years of international experience working with the UN and the governments of the UK and France in policy areas including climate change, food security, energy security, and sustainable development. Debbie is Director of Energy, Climate, and Environment at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, where she's worked for more than 20 years. The UK government has been Europe's standout supporter on alternative proteins and has been taking a leading role on both funding and regulatory normalization for cultivated meat. And finally, Christina is an environmental scientist and program officer on the biodiversity, climate, and health with the World Health Organization. Prior to joining WHO, she managed the WHO Joint Work Program on Biodiversity and Health with the Convention on Biological Diversity for about a decade. So ground rules. We have about 30 minutes. I can easily fill it with my questions for each of you, but do feel free to raise your hand if you would like to clarify a point or respond to one of your fellow panelists, or you can just jump in if there's a sufficient lull. We may have time at the end for audience questions. I guess it depends on how succinct we are in the conversation. So I'm going to start with Teresa. Systemic recently conducted an analysis of the opportunities of cultivated meat in the EU for climate, jobs, and economics. Can you tell us what the analysis found in terms of potential environmental and economic impacts, and in terms of what is needed for cultivated meat to scale? Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Yes, Systemic has done this analysis together with the GFI, and we have estimated that the potential economic value of the market of cultivated meat globally could be around 500 billion euros by mid-century, and Europe will contribute to this market. We found out that up to 40 billion market could be actually generated in Europe, and this will be if you assume that essentially Europe will be responsible for roughly 70% of the domestic market in the demand for cultivated meat by mid-century. But we have also found out that there is an interesting opportunity for the export market. As we know, Europe has a strong asset in terms of biotech and life sciences. So the question is, can Europe leverage actually this potential that they have in this sector to tap into the cultural cell input business and become a global player with the potential to export in these products around the world? So we found out that actually up to 0.4% of the GDP by mid-century in Europe could result from the contribution of direct and indirect contribution of the cultivated meat market. This will also generate some jobs in Europe in the range of 90,000 that will be directly attributed to this business. We were not able yet to develop full analysis of the indirect impact that could be generated by this business in terms of jobs. But we do believe that actually investing in cultural cell input could help unlock a full bioeconomy for Europe. So there are new applications that could be found, for example, vaccines that are associated with this technology, or the utilization of cultivated meat waste for new products such as bioplastic. So there are opportunities within the agricultural sector and actually in adjacent sector, in particular in pharmaceutical one, that could be explored thanks to this technology. So this is from an economical perspective. Climate-wise, we do know that actually cultivated meat is expected to deliver a very meaningful impact. If we think of emission, the impact of cultivated meat is roughly 1/3 of traditional meat products. If we think of land use, actually this ratio is 1:20, and if we think of water, it's 1:10. So actually we do have quite a number of benefits, and from a health perspective, very briefly, we could reduce actually some of the risk associated with antibiotic resistance and zoonotic disease that will be meaningfully reduced if this market manages to scale up.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Christina, I know a big focus for you is biodiversity preservation and global health. Can you talk about the importance of food generally to these massive global priorities, and then also more specifically what you see as the opportunities for alternative proteins?
Thank you so much. So I do want to start by saying alternative proteins are really not my area of expertise. Biodiversity and health are, but alternative proteins are not. That being said, I see a tremendous amount of opportunity moving forward. And why? Precisely because I've been working at the intersection of biodiversity, climate change, and health for over 2 decades now. And in order for us to meet the global commitments that we've made in each of these forums, it's absolutely clear that food system transformation is absolutely the common denominator. So I would say that, let's just think about some of the challenges, right? Just to start. We know that animal agriculture is responsible for, approximately 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We also know that 2/3 of the world's land has been modified, a large part of which is for agriculture and livestock. We also know that this contributes to approximately 70% of global deforestation. Global deforestation also has implications for infectious disease emergence, etc. So there are no questions when it comes to, the potential for food system transformation is absolutely tremendous. But beyond what we need to do in terms of sustainable conservation and preservation of biodiversity and sustainable management, etc., as Andrew Steer was saying, it's expected that there is going to be a 60% increase in meat consumption moving forward between now and 2060. How is that? It's clear that that's absolutely not sustainable. At the same time, we also know that there is a tremendous amount of food insecurity, that there are nutritional deficiencies that remain prevalent. We also know that unhealthy diets at the moment contribute to over 10 million deaths annually. So I'm very much, as I said, though I'm not an expert, I'm very much looking forward to the potential that the alternative proteins provide in terms of potentially filling some of those gaps in nutritional food insecurity, and in mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change that this sector has currently. But I also think that one thing that's critically important to us from a WHO perspective, from a health perspective, it's not just about filling the protein gap and ensuring that food security is there. We need to ensure that the nutritional requirements are met. And that's why it's so important that this be a science-based organization, and that we can work together moving forward. So really, I'm not here to teach. I'm here to learn and hopefully to work together moving forward, as I see a tremendous amount of potential there.
Excellent, thank you. And such a critical point, and I'm delighted that we have Sarah LaHaye here from GAIN on the next panel to talk about some of the micronutrient and macronutrient concerns that we need to be centering as we move forward. So Debbie Palmer, turning to government support, the UK has been a leader in the funding of alternative proteins, now running close to £100 million. This past August, the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council and Innovate UK invested $15 million in a new National Alternative Protein Innovation Center to drive research and innovation. What is the thinking here? Or put another way, why did the UK decide to invest in alternative proteins? And do you think other governments should do the same?
Thanks very much, Bruce. It's lovely to be with you all today. And it's really great, actually, to be following the comments that Teresa, you and Christine have made, and Sir Andrew, because you've really set out the case. At the moment, there's no cell-cultivated products approved for human consumption in the UK. But for all the reasons that have been set out, we see that this is really an area where we're going to need to move relatively quickly. There are a lot of benefits, there are a lot of opportunities, but at the heart of this, what we can see is that the current sort of processes and sort of industries around animal agriculture, for all the reasons that Christina and others have set out, are simply unsustainable. So we see a whole set of opportunities in this space, and I think alternative proteins are going to be part of a suite of solutions. And so Andrew set this out very nicely, that this is not about being dogmatic, but this is about actually growing the marketplace and recognizing that we are going to need a set of alternatives going forward. And really the UK is sort of in the process now of getting down to practical action. So what we're doing is thinking about how do we think about bringing products to the market in a safe and sustainable way. And that requires financing, but it also requires progress in terms of the regulatory environment. And you, Bruce, you talked about some of those. The UK, as you said, the UK Research Council on Biotechnology and Biological Sciences has invested 15 million. That's really, that new National Alternative Protein Innovation Centre, that's about fostering innovation. That's about learning, that's about experimenting, that's about working out what can be done in this space. Secondly, the Food Standards Agency in the UK is preparing to run a new sandbox on cell-cultivated products. That's about how can we start thinking now over the next 2 years about bringing products to market safely and learning with scientists and with suppliers about what that might take. And then thirdly, we also are working as a government to try and ensure that we're catalysing wider investment across the marketplace. For example, we're really proud that Imperial College London, one of our universities, is home to the Bezos Centre for Sustainable Protein. So Andrew, we're very grateful for the investment from the Bezos Earth Fund. So it is a set of issues around both funding and regulation. And just very quickly on regulation, we've been doing some work with GFI through the Agricultural Breakthrough that we set up at COP26, and that's about thinking to start scaling up funding. It's about how do we advance the regulatory best practices, but secondly, we've also earlier this year taken forward the primary legislation through the UK's Precision Breeding Act, and now we're working on the secondary legislation. So we're trying to get all the blocks in place basically to prepare over the next few years for what might be needed, both because of the risks, but also because there are massive opportunities in this space. Many thanks.
Excellent, thank you so much, and grateful for your leadership there. Zaytouni, you have a very long history with FAO, UNEP, you wouldn't know it to look at you, and the French and British governments. Now you're working with the FAIR initiative, which is a fascinating trajectory. Can you talk a little bit about how you see FAIR's work on investment risks around animal source foods dovetailing with your decades of work on hunger alleviation and climate change?
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's very nice to be part of this panel. I am representing FAIR, which is a network of investors of more than $75 trillion of asset under management. And you know, the agri-food systems are subject to so many risks, environmental, social, and economic. And what FAIR does is raises the profile, raises awareness of the risk associated with agri-food systems, and also the opportunities that arise from working towards sustainable and resilient agri-food systems, and hence the importance of innovation such as alternative proteins. And I'll just start by saying, putting really this in context, why does it matter? Why are we talking about diversification of proteins? First, we can see that agri-food systems are subject to so many pressures. The sector is so hungry in the consumption of water, of energy. You know, 70% consumption of water, 30% of energy, and also is a big contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. So it has so much potential to really provide the solutions that we need to tackle these crises that we face in climate change, biodiversity loss, global food security. So it is really pertinent to think about the agri-food systems in a different way, not just in terms of the problems and the challenges, but it's a great opportunity for us actually to see it as helping us to provide so many answers to the problems that we have today. The other issue we have is that the system has so many problems, so many contradictions. It is supposed to be providing food in a sustainable way that is within environmental boundaries. It's supposed to be nourishing people, but it's failing to do all these things. And it's about time to think about correcting, you know, this model and looking at a model that can actually reward regenerative agriculture, restoration of ecosystems, and provision of healthy diets to people. What does that mean is that we need to think about diversification of food and diversification of proteins, because this system also is, as I said, is failing from this front, but also it lacks resilience. You know, it's subject to so many shocks, and wherever we have shocks, not just climate change, but pandemics, for instance, and then the sector is so vulnerable. Production, distribution, consumption get affected. So we have to think about diversifying our sources of food and also sources of proteins. The relevance to proteins also is that the system, unfortunately, is not providing nutritious food. There are around 3 billion people around the world who can't afford the cheapest healthy diet. And also around the world, we rely on a very limited number of crops. Basically, there are 3 main crops that supply almost half of the world food supply. You know, maize, wheat, and or rice. So it's really very limited. So we have to open up, we have to be innovative, we have to be creative. And also, when we look ahead of the challenges facing us, a growing population, how are we going to feed and nourish a growing population unless we invest in innovation? We diversify our sources of income, so or sources of food and sources of healthy diets. So what FAIR does, it's really try to connect the policy side with the investment side. The investors cannot take this avenue just by themselves to invest in sustainable and resilient agri-food systems. We need policies in place. We need policies that can enable the investors to feel confident to put money into innovations such as diversification of proteins. And just to give you an example of, you know, the contradiction and where FAIR is really putting a lot of effort try to redirect some of the policies, because the policies have to be aligned with the objectives of global food security, the Paris Agreement, the biodiversity goal. Repurposing of subsidies is absolutely critical. The world spends about $2.6 trillion a year on subsidies. That's about 2.5% of global GDP. On agriculture specifically, it's 500 billion a year that are spent on agricultural subsidies. This goes into the opposite direction of where we want to be. So we have to align these policies of the goals of where the world needs to be to achieve sustainable and resilient agri-food system. So to align investment with policy, this is what FAIR is trying to do, to make sure that actually we're speaking the same language, we're heading towards the same direction, and highlighting the risks and opportunities going forward.
Thank you very much. Well, that was a phenomenal laying out of how big the issue is, and I think everybody spoke to that. And back to what Sir Andrew said, this is one, alternative proteins are one tool and a very robust toolkit, both sort of, yes, we need to address problems, and yes, we need to come up with solutions. So that's a nice segue into my next question for Teresa. Systemic did some work on the role of diet shifts in the decarbonization of the food and land use sector, and the potential compared across various levers, such as regenerative agriculture and food loss and waste. With the caveat that we absolutely need an all of the above, and we do need to be working on the entire range of interventions. And I know Sir Andrew mentioned the fairly recent World Bank report, Recipe for a Livable Planet, which cannot recommend highly enough. But can you talk about how you guys at Systemic are thinking about these issues and some of the work that you've done?
Yes, indeed. The main finding is that we will need these three levers actually to get close to the Paris Agreement climate targets. First, indeed, shifting our consumption pattern. Second, shifting our production practices. And third, reduce food loss and waste. But one of the interesting findings is that actually the impact that dietary shifts can have on this is very relevant. Out of the 17 gigaton of emission that currently the food system is generating, up to 8 could be reduced thanks to dietary shift. And this is because essentially the impact of alternative protein is much lower when it comes to emission generation. And we've also done something that we found was interesting, trying to estimate what's the return on investing in each of these levers. So we found out that for each billion being invested into dietary shifts, we can get 28 million tons of CO2 emission reduction. This ratio is actually much bigger than what we will get if we invest only in regenerative practices. And this is actually 4 or 5 times higher than the ratio that we can get by investing in electric vehicles or renewable energy. And why it's so convenient, let's say, to invest in dietary shifts? First, indeed, because of the mitigation potential, which is very big. But also because the cost of investing in dietary shifts is overall limited when we compare it to other measures. So overall, the investment needed to transition the full food system is in the range of 500 billion, and we need, let's say, only 150 billion to enforce and promote actually the dietary shifts. And this is even less than what we spend every year on EV, for example. So I'll say that this is actually interesting. So yes, we will need all these three levers, but there are more effective ways to direct our funding, and dietary shifts can be one of these.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. In the interest of time, we're going to have one question each for Debbie, Zeytouni, and Christina. And we have, if you can keep answers to about 90 seconds or so, that would be amazing. So WHO has been sounding the alarm on antimicrobial resistance, which is expected to kill 10 million people per year by 2050. And WHO has been raising it for about 25 years. Can you talk about the connection between AMR and industrial animal agriculture, or animal agriculture generally? What can be done, and do alternative proteins have a role to play, do you think?
Thank you so much. Okay, 90 seconds. I'm going to try. So, yeah, as you said, by 2050, 10 million additional deaths annually, and also an economic loss of 100 trillion globally. So there is a significant loss that is attributed to AMR. By the way, next week is AMR Awareness Week, so please do engage, everybody, because it is a tremendous and rising global health problem. So absolutely, is there a role to play? Eliminating antibiotics in protein production absolutely reduces the potential spread of AMR and the public health burden that's associated with it, as well as the economic burden that's associated with it. and it can contribute to avoiding the waste and pollution that is generated by industrial livestock, also by mitigating risks to water and to soil health, right? In addition, it can be part of a whole of government, whole of society approach that we need to address the impacts of AMR through a One Health approach. So I think that alternative proteins have a potential role to play, including through this more holistic lens. I don't know, is that 90 seconds? Because I can go on for another 5.
I realized as I was finishing up the question that I gave you a book length, sort of a question that warrants a book length response and asked you to do it in 90 seconds, but you rocked it. You totally rocked it. Fantastic. Thank you. All right, Debbie, feel free to, I mean, the UK, as I mentioned, has really been a leader on alternative proteins, both on the regulatory front, as you talked about, as well as on the funding front. So feel free to share whatever you want to share from the UK perspective, but if you felt called, I'd be interested in hearing sort of how you think about the UK's role leading. The UK's been a leader in the world on sort of climate change generally and biodiversity preservation generally. Now you're a leader on this one aspect of it. What is the sort of message to the rest of the world and other countries that are just beginning to think about this?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, we're beginning to I want to be a little bit humble. We're beginning to think about it as well in terms of, as I said, we're getting down to the practical applications. And I am really excited about the sandbox that's going to start in February for the next 2 years and really get into that process of thinking about how do you bring these products to market safely? What does it take? How can we work with the producers? You know, not fast tracking, but learning together and beginning to think about what signals the government needs to send to the market. I think the message to everybody else, as I said, is that the case has been made already. We know that alternative protein products could deliver up to over $1 trillion in global value by 2050. Andrew talked about the recipe for a livable planet. I think the key sort of takeaway that I took from that report is that out of 26 agricultural emission mitigation interventions, this one ranks second. I mean, that's extraordinary. Just that sort of piece of data alone, I think, is a bit of a call to action for all of us to really think about what we're doing because of the issues that have been raised about water, forestation, land use, you know, all of those things, acidification. So it feels to me it is time that we build up the data set and we all begin to get on the bus.
Wonderful, thank you. And Zaytouni, you're going to close out this panel. And again, feel free to share whatever you would like to share with the folks who are here, and we'll be promoting the recording of this extensively after as well. But if you felt so called, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the global investor community and the need for a clear regulatory path with regard to public safety issues and something like a global blueprint for regulation, which is one of the things that the UK is actually working on.
Great, thank you. I think going forward, it's important that we have clarity in terms of policy and also looking at the key paths that the world need to address to get us into more sustainable and resilient agri-food systems. What I mean by that is, you know, we're gathering here for almost the 30th year trying to resolve the issue of climate change, but unfortunately we're going backwards. We are not really going in the right direction, and we do have so many solutions, and food and agriculture is a critical one. And we cannot meet the 1.5 degrees C without tapping into the potential of food and agriculture. We really have to wake up to this opportunity, even though the food sector is a stubborn one compared to the other sectors. But we have to look at the reality, as Sir Andrew said, you know, that's the direction of the future. We have no choice. We left it so late. We have to adapt. We have to build resilience. And I think in terms of clarity, governments have to be accountable in being clear about the short-term and long-term policies that can enable the investment to come forward. There is no way that we can achieve these objectives without the effort of capital invested in this direction, and also the role of the philanthropies, the research centers like CGIAR, the Good Food Institute. It's great to see these communities really mobilized and really trying to drive this forward as fast as possible. My last word is, we don't have a choice but to do this really fast, really to wake up to this reality, because climate change, biodiversity loss, unfortunately, they're much faster than all our efforts combined today.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you, Christina, Teresa, Zaytouni, Debbie, for all of the incredible work that you're doing across to create a more just and sustainable food system. Incredibly grateful to you for sharing your time with us today as well. I would like to welcome our second panel to the stage. So I'd like to invite Lhasa, Sarah, Aditi, and Amar to join me in the front. I'll do quick introductions as last time and then launch into the conversation. You can sit wherever you'd like. Small enough I won't lose track of you. All right, as last time, quick introductions. Lhasa is the UN Foundation's Director for Climate and Food. He is an expert on food systems and sustainable agriculture with 20 years of experience in leadership, development, campaigning, and movement building. Recently, he has been leading some fascinating work from the UN Foundation to build strong bridges between work on agroecology and work on alternative proteins. Sarah is GAIN's lead for the Initiative on Climate Action and Nutrition, which aims to catalyze integrated climate and nutrition action. Sarah previously worked at the One Acre Fund, where she launched an end-to-end value chain intervention to locally produce shelf-stable, nutritious, plant-based protein products from smallholder-produced, climate-resilient crops. Aditi is Director for Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Impact Action Platform of the CGIAR. You need an extra large business card, I think, to get that all on. She's published over 80 peer-reviewed research papers, edited 4 books, and been awarded the Norman Borlaug Field Award from the Rockefeller Foundation and the World Food Prize Foundation. Finally, Amir is an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He's here representing Michael Kremer's Innovation Commission on Climate Change, Food Security, and Agriculture, which recently recommended alternative proteins as a high-impact intervention for climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as for hunger and malnutrition. As with our previous panel, we can easily fill up 30 minutes together, but please do feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to clarify a point or respond to one of your fellow panelists. You're also welcome to simply jump in if there's a sufficient lull, although it's occurring to me that with the microphone situation, jumping in is probably not going to actually work. If we have time, we'll go to the audience, although as last time, I suspect that we probably won't. And I would like to start, Sarah, with you. You previously led the One Acre Fund plant-based and meat pilot in Rwanda. Can you talk a little bit about that and the opportunity for alternative proteins to provide low-cost, nutritious protein and local jobs to people in low and middle-income countries?
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to, and you're kind of indulging me and letting me speak about this, because while I represent GAIN now, I was with One Acre Fund for almost a decade, and let's say this was my kind of last baby while I was there, and so I love getting to find ways to continue to support it and engage with it. So the idea for this value chain and venture work actually began when I was living in Rwanda at the time, spending a lot of time in rural Rwanda, but I was in rural Chile, and I was preparing for a kind of mountaineering expedition in Patagonia. I went into a small local little food shop that sells your basics: flour, flour, oil, salt, sugar, etc. And I was thrilled to find a large 1 kilo bag of TVP for about $1. And I was thrilled because this fit my use needs perfectly for what I was about to do. I was going to have no refrigeration. I was going to have not much access to fuel for cooking. And I was pregnant at the time, so I needed a really nutritious, high quality form of protein for the 10 days that I was going to be out. And yeah, I was living in Rwanda at the time, and it occurred to me, why have I never been able to find TVP, texturized vegetable protein, the kind of original plant-based meat, which I think it became famous when McDonald's was accused of using it as a meat filler because they realized that this tastes a lot like meat, but it's much cheaper, but still very rich in protein. So it occurred to me, you know, why isn't this available in the local mom and pop shops in rural Rwanda? So I went back and started doing a little bit more research, learned that at the time there was also pretty cool innovation going on with TVP in upper income markets, making it from sunflower seed protein, pea protein, and also did a little bit of more research on TVP in the African continent, found out it was available in parts of rural Kenya. There's a company producing it there, but just from soy, available in parts of Malawi and Zambia where there's more of a soy culture. And I set this kind of reflection against a bigger challenge that One Acre Farm was having at the time of incentivizing farmers to either continue to cultivate indigenous crops that are particularly nutritious and climate resilient like sorghum, or to begin cultivating crops that can be used for soil health benefits like cover crops, pigeon pea, green gram, mung bean. The main issue that we were having was making the economic case to farmers that these are crops that they should cultivate for soil health purposes, but that the farmers were right, there wasn't a good market for them. And One Acre Fund is kind of a unique organization that it has a very large footprint in how it works with farmers. And so I started wondering, you know, could we provide farmers with a formal market for these crops that have incredible soil health benefits and nutrition benefits, guarantee them a good price, but then convert this into a food that fits the use case needs of a rural community. Affordable, nutritious, easy to cook. You know, beans are widely consumed in places like rural Rwanda, but often have to be cooked for many, many hours. And that can be a challenge from the perspective of both the cost of fuel and the health impacts of using the types of fuel that are available. So then we embarked on some research, partnering with Wageningen University on the product design to see of the indigenous crops that are produced in Rwanda now or that we want to support the cultivation of, like pigeon pea. Can we produce a type of texturized vegetable protein, you know, from those crops? That research went really well. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But then probably the bigger question is, you know, is this something that people want to eat? And importantly, in places where there's a big aspiration to eat meat, could something like TVP fill that aspiration and you know, be a good consumer option? So when Acre Fund started, we did a round of focus groups, first trying to understand what the aspiration to eat meat really looks like, then serving a kind of, if you've ever been to Rwanda, there's classic Rwandan buffet, so serving a classic Rwandan buffet, but with the dishes prepared with a Kenyan form of TVP, then providing it for people to cook at home, then testing willingness to buy, interest in buying. And each time the feedback was just, I mean, way more positive than we were expecting. Our hypotheses on the use case were totally validated. It was very helpful that this was shelf stable, food safe, didn't need to be refrigerated, cooked relatively quickly. And I think the biggest takeaway was it did give the perception of eating a meal with meat, which was something that families really aspire for. So both the scientific research with Wageningen and then the consumer research that One Acre Farm was doing yielded really positive results, and the work is continuing today. They're doing large-scale market testing, and I think, you know, all indications look like this is going to go in the right direction.
That's really inspiring. Thank you. Lasse, for the UN Foundation, I mentioned in your bio that you're leading some powerful work focused on bringing together agroecology and protein diversification. Can you talk about the synergies of these two endeavors and why the UN Foundation and you think this work is so important?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bruce, for that introduction and that question. Let me just start by saying what you didn't mention in the introductions is I'm also a part-time farmer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about farmers. So I'm also just trying to give myself some credibility because I know even from farming part-time how hard that is. So I have tremendous respect for farmers and all the work they do. And I think that's really important because that's the essence of what we're trying to address here. When we talk about demand and the supply chains, without farmers, we cannot deal with what we're dealing with here. So what are we doing at UN Foundation? Well, essentially, we're looking into how to bridge the gap between what we produce and how we produce it. Why? Well, because for many years we've been seeing there's been this rift in the movement, the different movements. On one hand, you have all the proponents of alternative protein and protein diversification that often comes from global north countries, high-income countries, that talks about the necessity to cutting down on meat consumption. At the same time, we're dealing with nutrition insecurity in many low and middle income countries, and there has been the basic reaction to talk about meat reduction in many of those countries has been refusal and being actually often anger, because it has been seen as a continuation of food colonialism. In other words, it has been seen as high-income countries wanting to impose a certain way of producing and consuming food in low and middle-income countries, which hasn't been the case, but that's the way it's been perceived, unfortunately. And the reason for that, of course, is because of the food colonialism we've been seeing over the last 30 to 40 years, particularly. So how do we address this? How do we find a way to engage in this? Well, we tried many different ways. One has been through the formal processes. Here in UNFCCC, it is the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work, the former Coronivia process, where there's been a big challenge between the G77 and the EU and US on the other hand, on the other side, particularly around talking about agriculture or food, and food implying that we need to talk about consumption and dietary patterns. And that's been the crux of some of the conflicts we've been seeing. So taking all that into consideration, at the UN Foundation, we said, well, how can we address this in a way? How can we bring the different stakeholders together to look at how we address the aspect of overconsumption in high-income countries and nutrition deficiency in low and middle-income countries? And we found that the dialogue often starts with the narrative. So we initiated a process in which we tried to see how can we come together and focus on all the aspects that bind those different perspectives together, both from a perspective of global north-south, from a perspective of different sectors, but also from a perspective of all the different aspects that are intertwined in this. So the health, the environmental, the climate, the water use, and the social and the equity aspects as well. And what we found is there's luckily much more that binds us together than separates us. Now, it's easier said than done, because there's going to be a lot of compromises. And as you know, we always say that a good compromise leaves everybody unsatisfied. But I think there's hope here to get things done in the right way. First of all, there needs to be some kind of discussion around, from a health perspective, that although we would like to see in high-income countries, for instance, to move from a perspective of eating industrialized meat to organic, whole food, plant-based diets based on beans, pulses, and legumes. Well, that's unlikely to happen overnight. So from the health community perspective, we need to kind of acknowledge that there will not be an overnight shift to something as nutritious and healthy as that, i.e. alternative protein is going to play a massive role. On the other hand, if we don't start addressing how we produce food, including alternative proteins, when we talk about shifting to much more alternative proteins, we're not going to cut it. Why? Because first of all, there's the equity aspect. If we want to try to sell alternative protein to many low and middle income countries as the solution to food insecurity, well, if we don't do it in the right way, it will be seen as an affront and an imposition on the different countries. So we need to really look into how that is coined. And that's, to your question, is where agroecology or regenerative agriculture is going to play a big role, because the way food is produced across the globe is very different, as you know. And when we start talking about the synergies between how we produce food and what we produce, it becomes much more clear that this is an easy way to go. Because when we talk about cutting down on meat in high-income countries, it will address the aspects of land use, health, and everything that's just been mentioned. I won't repeat it here. But at the same time, it would also send the signal that there needs to be an equity lens to everything that we do. And in cutting down on industrialized traditional meat in high-income countries actually provides an opportunity for an increase of macronutrients and protein in low and middle income countries. one final thing is that unless we address it from the equity aspect and really look at it also in this context from the comment about differentiated responsibility perspective, we're not going to get very far. So we have to become much better at addressing the two sides at the same time, the nutrition insecurity and the overconsumption in high-income countries.
Thank you very much. Next up, Aditi, can you tell us about the work you're doing as a part of the technical committee for the Carbon Bond Initiative, specifically as it applies to alternative proteins? That sounds totally fascinating. What is it, and why is it important?
Thank you, Bruce. And I will answer your question, I promise, but I really wanted to follow on something that Lasse said, and before that, I think we heard from Dr. Stern, and that is the importance of narratives. Narratives matter. This morning we heard that much of the growth, 60% of the growth in protein will come from developing countries, and that narrative almost makes it seem as if the onus of solving the problem lies on the developing country. What that narrative does not say is the fact that there is a huge global inequity. Right now there are people in this world who are eating 150 kilograms of meat per person in a year versus people in sub-Saharan Africa who do not even get 10 kilos of meat in a year. So and this is why I really like the way you were framing the narrative, because without that we would kind of come to solutions that are not equitable, and that would lead to all these things around food colonization. So I just wanted to set that narrative a bit, because we constantly hear this, that most growth of animal source protein will come from the rich, from the low and middle income countries, without at the same time saying that that's because their base is very low. They consume almost nothing. That means that they have no nutritional security. While on the other side is also something I wanted to follow up with Teresa, is about the dietary shifts. And basically consumption side interventions, eating less meat would be very important, and alternative proteins would be very useful in that. So coming back to the work that I'm doing with the Carbon Bonds Initiative, the carbon bonds, I'm a part of the technical group of them, and what they do is they develop standards for, and once those standards are developed, then the different countries, particularly the high-income countries, can then develop their green finance around those. So their standards then get included in the taxonomies of the different private sector entities and of the government. So we are a technical group that are kind of working on how to develop those standards for alternative protein. And we have colleagues from GFI who are also providing excellent inputs into that. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. And yeah, such a critically important observation. As with energy transition, the countries that have done the least to contribute to the problem are oftentimes asked to bear an unreasonable degree of providing the solution. Our World in Data is one of the best websites in the world, in my opinion. And if you just Google Our World in Data and meat consumption, what will pop up is a country by country list. So the world right now is consuming about 360 million metric tons of land animal meat, another 210 million metric tons of sea animal meat. And what you just said is absolutely true. While a lot of the growth through 2050 is going to come from developing economies, they're still not going to come anywhere near catching up with developed economies. So they're definitely a critically important thing to take into account. And then, of course, some developing countries, there are people who could profit from the micronutrients and the macronutrients that animal source foods offer. That's a pretty nice segue, actually, into the question that I have for Amir. I know that, Amir, part of the Innovation Commission on Climate Change, Food Security, and Agriculture, you're trying to identify innovations that are cost-effective and ready to scale to address climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and food security. Can you talk about that a little bit in the context of alternative proteins, please?
Of course. Thank you, and Thanks for organizing this. This is excellent. I should start off like Christina did, saying I'm not an expert in this area, and I think for the purpose of what I'm going to talk about and for what the Innovation Commission was doing, its mission, that's actually a good thing in a way. We're approaching this from the point of view of saying what are a set of key innovations ready to scale, as you said, for addressing issues of climate change adaptation, climate mitigation, and particularly with thinking about the benefit of extending those benefits in low and middle income countries. And so innovation just in general is a public good. It doesn't get the type of investment it should without putting on some kind of property rights like patents, etc. For lower and middle income countries, as we all know, overly restrictive patents are often quite problematic. It makes a strong case for public funding in this area. The reason why innovation doesn't get invested in to the extent that it should, particularly in low-income settings, is because once the idea is out in the world, nobody can profit from that, the person who invested in it. So public money is public and philanthropic money is very much an important part of this. That's not just for developing the technologies, and I think one of the reasons why we thought this was a very useful innovation to highlight was because to some extent the technology has been demonstrated as viable. The scaling of it for low and middle income countries doesn't just rest on identifying the core nitty-gritty details of how the technology works, what cells to use, etc., but also things like Sarah was saying in terms of adjusting the foods, the proteins, to the tastes of a market, working very carefully with focus groups, working carefully on that side of the research and development. Again, public funding for this could be totally transformative. So that's why we came to think about alternative proteins as something we would recommend here. There's another aspect of this which is kind of key when thinking about climate, and you mentioned about the energy transition, and I think there's a strong parallel here, which is this is not an equal playing field. When you compare alternative proteins and animal-based proteins, it's not an apples to apples comparison, it's not a protein to protein comparison, because as we've heard already, the carbon content embedded in that animal protein is about somewhere between 3 and 10 times more than what would be in that animal and in the alternative protein. That is something which is not priced into the value that we're paying for that. There's very little prospect that we'll end up paying a global carbon price to actually internalize that price. But some work that I've done as with wearing one of my other hats in estimating what the social cost of carbon is, the value or the damages that are caused by releasing an extra ton of carbon into the atmosphere, places that, and it's used for US regulatory purposes now, at around $200. So think about that as every extra ton that you pull from the atmosphere is removing $200 of damages in terms of health, in terms of health impacts of increased heat, in terms of decreases in labor productivity, in terms of food supply loss, all of the impacts of climate change from heat. If we were to think about just shifting, if we think of about 5 gigatons of just, for example, 5 gigatons, which is roughly the right order of magnitude of CO2 equivalent emissions coming from livestock purely, and reduce that by 1%, so down by about 50 million, putting that $200 price per ton reduced ends up with about a $10 billion social benefit that you would get. The public investment in this area is, I think, on the order of just under $1 billion, somewhere like that. It's nowhere near the social benefits that you're actually getting from it. So that protein to protein comparison was something that highlighted that this is not just good for many other reasons, macroeconomic reasons that people have talked about, but from a climate change point of view, which I think is key. Something that was mentioned at the start, which I think is also very important to note here, is there is another way in which this transition to alternative proteins would require public funding, which is that this is not an equal playing field for other reasons, because there's an incumbency advantage of animal-based proteins. And that's not something which, as was pointed out at the start, it's not the cattle farmers necessarily coming angrily saying don't take our cows away, but it's just the fact that there's a whole supply chain, there's a whole system of customary ways of interacting with meat which are very difficult to displace. The same way that it's very difficult to displace people's use of gas cars in favor of electric cars, because it's a change of behavior and there's a system in place for that. So public funding can first of all shift that. You can get the incentives right to change this, but a key thing to think about, which I think has also been mentioned, is there is a transition cost there, which is very important. Making sure that this is not completely disenfranchising everybody who is currently making money from meat and replacing that, so that a lot of people end up losing it, particularly when you think about producers in low-income countries where those losses are really serious in terms of people completely losing their livelihoods. So I think this is why we think of this as a kind of a high-value proposition, both for climate and for generally food security in lower and middle-income countries.
Awesome, thank you so much. I think we have a link to the position paper that you guys put out at gfi.org/Kremer. I'm pretty sure it's there. So once again, on behalf of time, if you can keep answers to like 90 seconds to 2 minutes, that would be awesome. I will give you a prompt, but if there was something else that you're burning to say in this session, feel free to just ignore my prompt and go in whatever direction you want. I will start with you, Sarah. So I know when you were at 1 Acre and now in your work at GAIN, you're thinking a lot about nutritional considerations with regard to alternative proteins. So what should we be thinking about in terms of macronutrients, micronutrients, especially in the low and middle income country context, but feel free to go broader than that if you would like.
Thank you. Yes, and I first want to respond to your excellent remarks, Aditi, and clarify that for both 1 Acre Fund and GAIN, the broader position is on promoting access to animal source foods in contexts where consumption is still low and they could play a critical role in meeting, in particular, micronutrient deficiencies. The work that I mentioned in 1 Acre Fund was more tied to creating circular value chains in a country that promote jobs, that promote access to what people can't afford right now, which is generally meat. That's why consumption is so low. So thank you for those remarks. I think to get back to that broader point, that animal source foods are particularly rich in certain macro and micronutrients. When it comes to protein, and for GAIN, we actually have adopted the terminology alternatives to animal source foods because we want to point to the fact that it's not just protein. It's about protein and fat in the macronutrient category, and micronutrients in particular, iron and zinc and vitamin D and calcium, and of course B12, which only comes from animal source foods. And so if we are replacing meat in our diet, or if we don't have adequate access to meat and dairy, normally those are the micro and macronutrients that we need to be ensuring we're having adequate consumption of. In the global north, we've already talked about this, there's just excess consumption of meat. So things like protein digestibility and protein quality are of much less importance because generally people are meeting or exceeding their protein nutrient intake needs. In the global south, that's quite different, where there isn't excess consumption, and so protein digestibility and protein quality is of bigger importance, and that relates to the amino acid profile of the food. You can achieve all amino acid intake needs if you eat a diverse diet, but we know in the global south diversity is a bigger challenge, and so then having that really rich source of protein and micronutrients has a different role to play. Global north, global south, I think the other main considerations, one thing that's exciting within the kind of fat world, fat's a really essential nutrient. There are some fats that are better than others. Some saturated fat is okay, but there is, I think, the opportunity with alternative proteins to look towards less processed, healthier fats, and in particular those long-chain omega-3s, EPA and DHA. If there are ways to include those, I think that's exciting from a nutrition perspective.
Great, thank you very much. Lasse, I was actually going to mention that you are a farmer in my second question, because every time I hear you talk about these issues at any length, you're talking about farmers and others, especially in the global south, need to consider farmers in all aspects of how we talk about food, obviously, as you pointed out. But if you could chat just a little bit more about farmers in the global south and alternative proteins and how you're thinking about that, I think that'd be fascinating.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. I'll get to your question in 1 second. Just want to talk first about the global north aspect as well, because research and studies shows us that if we're shifting away from industrialized animal agriculture to more plant-rich diets across particularly OECD countries, we actually will be creating more jobs, better jobs, more gender equitable jobs, safer jobs. And kind of the same way as we moved away from coal and oil to renewable energy, it's safer, it's better, the better aspects for equity and so forth. There was a study that came out by the International Labour Organization and the Inter-American Development Bank a few years ago that shows that if Latin America and the Caribbean were to shift to more plant-rich diets, by 2030 we'd have 15 million new jobs, 15 million jobs net. So that's important to know because to your point, we talk about shifting the food system and we have to address stranded assets, compensation plans for farmers. Actually, it is a good transition that will over time boost GDPs of OCE countries. So that's good to keep in mind. And to your question, Bruce, while I've been in many conversations with different stakeholders, including ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, who themselves are also saying, well, we need to have a global reduction of animal protein from an equity perspective. And when it comes to the global south or low and middle income country livestock farmers, they're not necessarily looking to intensify, they're looking to improve, have better access to veterinary care, extension services and so forth, and make sure that meat at the correct amounts is affordable and available to local people. Because what often happens if you improve and intensify local productions is that starts to become interesting to cater to more global north markets. And then you'll have the model where North African countries are producing lots of meat for export to the EU, which makes it much more expensive and makes it impossible for local people to afford meat in the same way as they could before. And it also pushes smallholder farmers out of business, including pastoralists, Maasais, and so forth. So what we need to do is really focus on improving the systems for smallholder farmers, pastoralists in global south countries, and also as part of that, looking into more long-term opportunities for meeting nutrient needs with other sources than traditional meat.
Thank you very much, Lasse. And Aditi, I'm glad that you jumped in on that last question and sort of shared some of your thinking about global north, global south. Because I think, as I read the various documents coming from FAO and coming from CGIAR, thinking about planetary boundaries and thinking about 3 billion people not having access to nutritious food, 750 million people being malnourished. This is a thing when I learned about it when I was very young that just set my life on a whole new trajectory and has been kind of the motivating factor in so much of how I've lived my life. And there are things one could do that would point toward trade-offs. Obviously, the goal is win-win ways of thinking about things, but there just can be trade-offs, and I think you kind of nodded at that a minute ago. Probably nobody thinks about how to sort of solve both nutritious food and climate and biodiversity more than CGIAR, and you at CGIAR, maybe nobody more than you. So how do you think about that? What should we be thinking about?
So there are 3 reports that I want to talk about. Being a scientist, I like talking about reports. And by the way, Lasse, you always steal what I was about to say. So I did want to say that point about ILRI. So it was great that you already said that. But let me refer to 3 reports. One is the IPCC report, Working Group 3. I think it was Chapter 7 that actually talked a lot about demand management. So we have covered that extensively. Eating less meat and eating healthier meat will go a long way, particularly in the high-income countries. The second one is also I'm involved in is with the Earth Commission, where they do the planetary boundaries. So one of the recent papers that have come out with planetary boundaries is again saying the same thing, that we are breaching the planetary boundaries is because only 20% of the top consumers. So all of these kind of, say the same thing. And the third one that I'm particularly very fond of is the breakthrough agenda report that we did at the CGIAR, and where alternative proteins was actually one of the 7, ways in which we can actually take care of both the climate goals as well as the nutrition and biodiversity goals. So the breakthrough agenda, which is led by the UK and the Egypt government and was launched in COP26 in Glasgow, what it does is it's about really the agriculture agenda is around food systems transformation, and how do you do that? What are those breakthrough approaches and technologies that have a tick mark on the 4 things? The 4 things are, it should still lead to farmers having decent income. The second is around resilience. The third is around it reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And the fourth is around it leads to better outcomes in terms of water, land, and environment. And not a lot of technologies actually tick across all the four. Alternative protein is one of them. And while alternative protein, the chapter concluded that its viability is much higher in places where we are looking to replace, animal source food with alternative proteins. But it also has potential in developing countries where it could be a new source of income and livelihoods. Like say in the work that we do at ILRI, where I'm hosted, by the way, one of our focus is to improve animal productivity through better health intervention, better vaccines, because the per capita GHG emission of our animals are very high simply because they produce very less in terms of both meat and milk. So one of the ways is to improve animal productivity, and if we do that, taking care of animal health, that solves a part of the problem. But then what does it stop farmers to have more and more animals? If the total number of animals goes up, then it doesn't really help. That is where I think alternative protein can come in. What if we work with the farmers to train and they become those small and medium entrepreneurs who can actually work with organizations that are producing those alternative protein, So because a lot of the work would be around turning our farmers into more agile entrepreneurs. So maybe this could be a part of the solution as well, that while they do better and efficient animal farming, which takes care of health of the animals, they also use some of that income to do these kind of work that has to be really decentralized. I mean, you cannot have one centralized production of alternate protein, then that's shipped all around the world, because then that will also have a large carbon footprint. So maybe something to think around, having farmers as entrepreneurs.
Thank you. That was really inspiring, and all of that work is so inspiring. So, Amir, you probably don't need direction from me for your question, because we've sort of been in the Commission's sweet spot for our entire time together. So feel free to ignore this and go wherever you would like to go, but you will close us out. The report found, quote, alternative proteins can help relieve food insecurity by reducing the risk of food price spikes from animal feed demands. I think that sort of macroeconomic analysis and global food systems is pretty fascinating. If you would like to chat about that, please do, or whatever you would like.
I'll try and stay within 90 seconds too. I'm a UChicago economist, also a climate scientist, but a UChicago economist for today, so I'll talk about prices because that's what UChicago economists do. There's two aspects that I'll talk about, not directly at your question, but I think two things that I wanted to say in the interest of time. I'll focus on those. There is a study, which was a really excellent study, which shows that for even just a small percentage of the protein sources shifting towards animal-based, to alternative proteins, away from animal proteins, just 4% of global supply could lead to an almost 25% reduction in food prices globally. That kind of a major effect talks to exactly what you're saying. Smoothing out macroeconomic price shocks due to animal feed demand, which is one of the biggest demands for food, and pushes people who are at the very low end of the income scale away from being able to consume the food that they need. A lot of those people who are not able to meet their nutritional needs are not falling below into the very dangerously malnutrition category, the lower 20% in terms of stunting, wasting, and other things. These are people who just have a general macronutrient deficiency. So lower food prices just already start to help in that case. But for those lower 20%, and I'll probably end here, one of the fascinating things we found while we were doing our research is this, which is that in those instances of acute food crises, and another part of my research in my life is thinking about the effect of climate change, disasters, and other things on nutrition, and particularly acute malnutrition among kids. In those crises, one of the solutions to that is the disbursement of ready-to-use therapeutic foods, things like plumpy nut, etc. What we found while doing this work was that the single biggest price component in those foods is milk powder. Shifting that to an alternative protein could dramatically lower the price of this food. UNICEF is the largest purchaser of these foods. They're still estimating reaching fewer than 50% of the people who need those in each year. And with the fact that we'll be entering a world, we're pushing ourselves into a world where those types of acute food crises, due to climate change, increased frequency of disasters, becomes more and more common. Anything we can do to extend that supply, I think, is really critically important. It's one of the many reasons why I think this is just win after win after win for this innovation.
All right, win after win after win. I like that. All right, thank you so much, Sarah, Lhasa, Aditi, Amar, all of us at GFI and the world are so grateful to you for devoting your vocational lives to creating a food system where everyone has access to healthy food and we stay within climate and other ecological boundaries. So thank you. So I'm going to see if I can summarize some of what we heard from Sir Andrew and our 8 panelists, some of what I'm taking away from our 80 minutes together, and then I will ask Dr. Ismahan Elouathi to offer some final remarks to close us out. So Sir Andrew Steer summed up the theory of change and why the Bezos Earth Fund is so excited about alternative proteins. We've been trying to convince people to eat less meat for 50 years. It hasn't been working. What we need is alternatives that are delicious, affordable, and nutritious. And the Bezos Earth Fund is funding research centers and included alternative proteins as one of the 3 focuses in their $100 million AI challenge. Teresa from Systemic started us off by talking about the climate gains and also the fact that this can be win-win for farmers and economic growth. Zaytouni from FAIR gave us a pretty amazing rundown of just how big the food system is and the importance of so many different solutions in food. The amount of damage to climate and biodiversity is huge. We need every tool in our toolkit to address it. Debbie from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office showed us how governments can respond to the harms and how governments can lead with some great examples of funding from the UK government, as well as they're leading the way on regulatory. Christina from WHO gave a sort of borderline One Health way of looking at some of these problems, talking about the importance of biodiversity preservation, antimicrobial resistance, and the importance of food systems, and perhaps the importance of alternative proteins as addressing these issues. Lhasa from the UN Foundation talked about the importance of unifying food movements. We'll be stronger together than we are apart, and the importance of centering on farmers, especially in the Global South, as a farmer. Sarah from GAIN talked about the importance of getting nutrients right, as well as her inspiring work before GAIN, looking at alternative proteins as a direct intervention. Aditi really centered us, I think, on the importance of really looking for interventions that don't cast blame on anyone, and really the responsibility of the global north, and making sure that we're not sacrificing global south priorities, especially around health and nutrition. And Amir shared the fact that the current system is plagued by market failures that under-prioritize food solutions, especially where animal products are concerned, and talked about alternative proteins both for direct intervention as well as for macroeconomics. So I didn't come anywhere near doing justice to 80 minutes, but those are the things that I'm taking away. So with that, I want to say thank you again to FAO and CGIAR for welcoming us and to everybody in this room. And it is absolutely my honor and delight to introduce Dr. Ismahan Elouathi, the Executive Managing Director of CGIAR. She previously held the position of Chief Scientist at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Prior to that, she was Director General of the International Center for Biosaline Agriculture based in the UAE. Dr. Elouathi has held several major scientific and leadership positions, senior, not major, although both, including Director of Research Management and Partnerships Division at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. When the UK government and the International Energy Agency decided to map a path toward a sustainable future, and Aditi talked about this, they tapped CGIAR to lead the food portion of that analysis, and they have been prioritizing alternative proteins as one critical intervention for both hunger alleviation and climate mitigation. And I am incredibly excited and inspired to have you joining us, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And I'm very happy that I caught most of the two panels. So what I heard really from both two panels, I'm sorry that I missed your opening, Dr. Andrew. So for me, really what came across that we need to recognize that we have differentiated realities. So 20% of the population is actually responsible for most of the greenhouse gas from livestock. That's really a number that Aditi said that talks to me. And what it says really is that because there are differentiated realities, we're not looking for one solution, we're not looking for two solutions, we're looking for multiple solutions. And we need to keep in mind that differentiated realities in Global South versus other parts. I loved really the mention on cost of transition that Amir mentions. So as we did the just transition in energy, we need to really realistically and very strongly call for a transition for agri-food system. Right now, the way we are portraying it, it's very much the cost goes on the farmers. And we know that the farmers get the least ROI in the whole value chain. And there takes me on that cost. And I want to really single that we have with us here Isabelle de Citre, who works very well with innovator and SMEs. We need more SMEs, we need more innovation, we need to bring youth on board, and we need to bring private sector investments to bring all these solutions. If we're talking about multiple thousand of them, we need you, Isabelle, and people like you that work with innovators and SMEs. And the other point is the public procurement. Public procurement can help us. So I don't think I need to talk about how important it is to have alternative proteins. I think Zitouni gave it really justice, and so did Bruce. It's about really finding those solutions. But if we want to get to those solutions, we need to align incentives. We can't keep talking about it and putting all the blame and all the cost of that transition on the farmers, particularly the 500 million small farmers in least and low middle income countries. So we need to do it right, and that's where I see really public procurement as a huge weapon, not a weapon, as a huge manner of doing it. Right now you mentioned UNICEF, for example, and the need to powder milk. What about UNICEF producing more food that is based on other things? And there is a bit of a lobby as well that we have to recognize. It's not that the solutions are not there. There are solutions, but there is a lot of economical gain behind certain things, and we need to look at it. One of the things that marked me, I was in Australia in August, and I was talking with a farmer that has 13,000 hectares, and he was producing, in a rainfed, producing colza. So colza, it's in French, but I'll have it. Arabidopsis and wheat. And I told him, how much you break even? When do you break even, Joe? He said, at 4,000 hectares. So for him to break even, it's 4,000 hectares. And he has 13,000. How are we asking small-scale producers to do that with the economics we have around food? And that's where really what Kramer is doing, it's super important, and all of you, the team. We have to talk about the economics. We have to make it possible for small-scale producers to produce well and have a decent life. And if the economics takes 4,000 hectares to break even in Australia, so what are the chances for a poor African in Mali or in Senegal or in Uganda or anywhere to break even? So for me, really, the bottom line of it, CGIAR, as the largest publicly funded institution, we're working on all solutions. But we wanted to make it right. We want to make sure that our solutions, it's not a hype. It's not because we are interested in it, we start scaling it. We need to have evidence, we have to have data. We have to make sure that what we are proposing as solutions are a solution for today and are still a solution in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We can't jump on a boat when the boat is still under construction. And that's where, for me, alternative protein are amazing. And by the way, my 16 years is a hardcore vegan. So I have somebody at home that remind me that every single meal. So, but it's very important that the solutions that we are bringing are alleviating poverty. They are helping us on malnutrition in those communities that needs it the best. And it's a path forward for a more sustainable earth and more sustainable life and livelihood on this planet. thank you very much. Thank you to GFI to be with us. It's really wonderful. It's so good to see the room full of people, and it's so good to see so much evidence around what we need to do, from increasing productivity in the animal, in the livestock we have in least income countries, to doing more research to find thousands and thousands of solutions. And here I can't really fail to talk about VAX, the Vision for Adapted Crop and Soils, that is our vehicle at CGIAR to really diversify to a number of species, and many of them gonna give us those alternative proteins. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm just going to close by saying thank you again to you for hosting us and just for all of the work that CGIAR does. It's just incredibly inspiring. Also to our friends at UNFAO and to all of you for being here and the work that you're doing to create a more just and sustainable